So I want to acknowledge one of my favorite mixed method studies is, in fact, it's an 8-year study of senior citizens living in a downtown area where the area kept, the places they were living in kept getting demolished to make room for businesses. So it's a lovely study, and it was sequential. But each data set, each phase directly informed the next one, and there was even some integration across databases. Okay, so now I'd like to turn to key concepts in mixed methods inquiry, and these are the 3 that I'd like to talk about. And again, on Wednesday, I'll talk about a 4th, which is integrated data analysis strategies and techniques. Mainly, I'm going to use good examples. So these are the 3 I'd like to talk about. Why mixed methods? What are the key purposes for mixing? Second is, well, just what is being mixed in a mixed methods inquiry? And the 3rd are key dimensions of mixed methods design. So let me turn to the first one, why mixed methods? My work in this area literally started about 30 years ago, probably a little bit more, with a review of 57 evaluation studies that had mixed methods. Evaluation studies because I'm an evaluator, and because I think evaluators were a bit ahead of other social scientists. We are ultimately very practical inquirers. We need to respond to the demands of the context, and so I think there was more openness in the evaluation community to use a variety of methods in the same study, perhaps. But we reviewed carefully 57 mixed method evaluation studies, and it was a generative engagement. We were trying to find, well, what were they doing? We needed to describe with some formality or structure the kinds of mixes that were taking place, and there were about 6 or 8 different categories we were looking at, one of which was purpose. And we came up with these 5 purposes, which I'll spend a little time on. They have endured quite well since the mid-1980s. I still read a lot of mixed method studies. I'm blessed or troubled or whatever by being an associate editor of the Journal of Mixed Methods Research, so I read for that, and I still read the journal. And I'm a little puzzled by the fact that not very many mixed methods researchers or evaluators refer to these purposes. It's not because I think they're so wonderful, it's just I think they're very useful. I think they help us in being more planful and thoughtful about the mixing that we're doing. So I just acknowledge that if you read 10 mixed method studies, maybe 1 will refer to a purpose that's listed on this slide. Again, I like them because they do offer distinctive rationales. Each is different from the other. And because these different rationales help me design the study. Different designs go with different rationales, so I think it contributes to a better study. So I want to illustrate these different purposes as I go along with a context, a hypothetical context. The hypothetical context, although very common in my country, is the evaluation of a well-established early reading program for children in high-poverty, racially and ethnically mixed urban neighborhood schools. So this is a kind of program and funding that's very common in the U.S., where we're trying to help children in under-resourced communities and under-resourced schools do better in academics, and reading and math are the high priorities. The evaluation questions are pretty typical. One about implementation, how well is the program being implemented, and the second about outcomes. Is it mattering at all to the children's reading proficiency? So I'm going to go through each of these 5 purposes, define them, and then illustrate them in this context. Enhanced validity of inferences through the convergence of data from multiple sources is what we called in our review triangulation. I'm sure there's a Spanish word for triangulation. triangulación. And many of you probably know this term. It's a commonly used concept and term in social science. I think it came originally from Donald Campbell and Fisk, multi-trait, multi-method measurement matrix. You're probably all too young to know that. That was 1956, I think. First used there, it was used by Norman Denzin, he's a sociologist, now a very post-structural thinker, who used it in his 1978 book on research methods in sociology. And it usually means, as it defined on this slide, convergence, that the data from the two methods agree. They both say the same thing, they tell the same story, so we have greater confidence in our results because we have more data that supports a particular inference. In the mixed methods literature, in fact, early in the mixed methods literature, triangulation was a synonym for mixing methods. It meant everything. And I think it's more useful to have it mean one thing rather than I'm doing a triangulation study, because it doesn't communicate very well. So in the beginning, it was a synonym. Now it's used quite loosely to mean I'm hoping to get better results. But we like to define it more narrowly in the strict sense of convergence, where we get the same information or support for the same information from two or more sources. In the example, we assess the key outcome of reading proficiency through testing and through observation of children who are engaged in reading. So that would be a mix, probably at a method level. And if the two sets of results agreed, we would have stronger support and confidence in those results. I think triangulation, I say the challenges, I think it's a whole lot easier to talk about than to do, especially perhaps in a mixed methods context. I could really see in this particular example, if we did a structured observation of children engaged in reading through some kind of checklist, we would be much more likely to get convergence with a reading test than if we did an unstructured observation of children reading, looking at the quality of the experience. So it's a little bit challenging to think about this. And I should have mentioned this before. I think I did say this. I think it's much more useful and easier if you're planning a mixed method study to identify several constructs for mixing and mix around those. We'll talk about that again in the design part. So I think triangulation is easy to say and hard to do well. The second of these 5 purposes is complementarity. This one is one of the 2 most popular, the other most popular being development. In this case, we're not trying to get a convergence, but we're trying to get complementary findings so that we get more of the phenomenon that we're trying to understand. We get more multiple dimensions or facets of a complex phenomenon. And program implementation is a really good candidate for complementarity because that's a complicated phenomenon, and we could get more of what we're aiming for through both a structured and a more ethnographic set of observations of the program in action. This probably is a mix at a method and a methodology level, kind of a structured observation and an ethnographic observation. Structured and ethnographic observation. Again, I mentioned how popular this is. In my own reading, I find people will call something triangulation and it's really complementarity. We are trying to get more of a complex phenomenon by measuring it in a couple of different ways. The third kind of purpose for mixing is what we called initiation. And this is the possibility of getting new, not previously thought about, generative insights through pursuit of dissonant results from 2 different methods or methodologies. A planned triangulation or complementarity study may not yield convergence or a more rounded portrait of a particular phenomenon, but they may clash. They may tell different stories. They may say the children that the implementation looked very much adhering to the program design, and was smooth and operating very well through a structured observation instrument, and absolutely different from an ethnographic instrument. There was more dissent from the children and more acting out and more confusion in the room than the structured instrument caught. So initiation is this idea that instead of throwing up your hands and throwing the study away, it's like, ooh, if you have confidence in both sets of data, pursuing this disjuncture, this dissonance, can lead to some very important insights about the phenomenon of interest. It can lead to a set of ideas or a pathway to understanding you had not thought of before. I say this because there are examples in the literature that demonstrate just this. It's very hard, I think, to plan for initiation, to say, okay, I'm going to do a mixed method study and hope the results disagree. In my country, nobody would fund that. They wouldn't think that was really a good idea. So in some sense, initiation is a placeholder for, again, not just despairing over results that do not agree, but rather trying to make sense of the disagreement. And that can lead you to an insight, to a pathway, to somewhere that you hadn't thought of before, and it offers some important contribution to the study at hand. Development, as I mentioned, is the second most popular. This kind of practice has been used for decades and decades. Mixed methodologists just appropriated it into our framework because it does often use a mix of methods. And it's the idea that we can get more contextually and practically appropriate data by using the results from one method to help inform the development of another. Common development designs are doing a set of interviews in a context to help you understand a little bit more about the context, the way people use language, the terms they use to refer to certain aspects of the school day, and then using the results of the interview to help develop your survey or questionnaire. That's extremely common. Not uncommon are using the results of a regression analysis to help pick regression analysis to help pick a sample for some case studies. You might pick a sample that's on the regression line. You want typical cases at varying levels of pretest scores. Or you might want the extreme cases. You pick cases that are far away from the regression line. They're the cases that are doing something differently. And probably most usefully, the cases that are above the line, that are doing better or performing in a higher capacity than many of the other cases, studying the best cases. And in our example, we could use the results of a structured set of observations of children engaging in the reading program to select a sample for more intensive qualitative observational and interviewing. So this development study could be a method and a methodology mix. One of the challenges, again, because this practice is not new with mixed methods, people have been doing this for quite a long time. One of the challenges is being creative with development. And one really fun way that I have seen people be creative, and I will share this example on Wednesday, you have method 1 that informs the development of method 2. You analyze the results of method 2, you go back to the results of method 1 for some kind of joint or integrated analysis. And especially okay with qualitative work because you don't lose any degrees of freedom. Qualitative work doesn't have degrees of freedom, so we don't have to worry about using them up. So I think because we know this standard practice of using the results of one method to help develop the other, being creative with this is a challenge. Okay. The last purpose for mixing is expansion, and this is the idea of extending the reach or potential policy or political importance or theoretical importance of a study by including a method that you normally wouldn't include. So in addition to structured assessments of reading outcomes, we could include unstructured observations of the program in action. So we're measuring different things with different methods. But again, the idea is to extend the reach of the study. Now, this has puzzled me for a while until I remembered when the evaluations we reviewed for this set of 5 purposes happened. They happened in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when it wasn't very common to include qualitative methods of any kind in basic evaluation research. One could do a structured set of observations of implementation and test the kids for the outcomes. That was a much more common study. So I think what we saw, and that's why this expansion is on the list, is we saw some evaluators taking advantage of the recent popularity of qualitative methods kind of came on the scene in a mass way in that time period to say, oh, I'm going to actually learn a little bit more about program implementation by including some interpretive or qualitative observations in my study. But I raised the question of whether this is now kind of passé. I don't know if it's passé, but it might be. So the second aspect of mixed methods, I've been referring to it, but I want to formalize it a little bit more, is just what is being mixed in the mixed method study. And I have mentioned that we can mix at the level of method, that's technique, a survey, and an interview. We can mix at a higher level, what I would call methodology, which I think of as an inquiry logic. We do a survey study and an interview study. We do a case study as a follow-up to a quasi-experiment. Methodology is a package of appropriate ways to think about inquiry that includes what are the kinds of questions that are asked. Survey answers different questions than case study. So the kinds of questions that are asked, the kinds of instruments that are used, the way it's applied in a particular context, analytic techniques, sources of error, and inferences that are possible. So I think of methodology as a bundle of ways of thinking about doing social inquiry. And then there is the paradigmatic level, philosophical assumptions and stances, one's beliefs about the nature of the social world, is it real or constructed? One beliefs about the nature of the knowledge we can have about that social world, is that knowledge real or constructed? Is it generalizable or contextual? One's views about the role of values in social inquiry, about the role of the inquirer as a social critic. Paradigm is all of that, and sometimes more. I'm frustrated in reading a lot of mixed method studies that most of the inquirers don't tell me about their assumptions and beliefs. Rarely you can see it because it's evident in the work that they do, but it's very hard sometimes to make sense of a study when I don't know what are their assumptions about the phenomena that are being studied. So just to illustrate the post-positivist paradigm, realism, post-positivism, which remains dominant in my country. I think you're probably all more enlightened than we are in the US. But these are the standard assumptions of post-positivism. The social world is real. It exists independent of our knowing it. Knowledge of the social world is propositional and generalizable. Appropriate methodologies are large-scale and quantitative, and values don't belong in social inquiry. There's probably others, but those are the standard ones to illustrate what I mean by paradigm. So in the third concept and a set of ideas that I'd like to talk about in mixing methods is that of the key dimensions of mixed methods designs. We talked about purpose, what are the purposes for mixing, decisions about at what level do I want to mix, and then key dimensions of mixed methods design, which I will present in a second. I would like to acknowledge that mixed methods in practice is quite a bit more complicated than mixed methods in theory. You often don't have just method A and method B, or methodology A and methodology B. You've got C, D, E, and F as well. and you're going to mix these two for this purpose and those two for that purpose, and this one might afford a mix. So I'm fully aware that this theory is, or this portrait of mixing methods is simplistic. It doesn't match our reality, and sometimes it's very hard to design a mixed method study with multiple methods to serve multiple mixed methods purposes. I just want to acknowledge that. It takes some creativity and persistence to do that really well. But the reason I keep harping on being clear about the purposes for mixing is because I think design follows purpose. I think the different decisions we make about design, we make different decisions about design dimensions based on the purpose. And that's where, of course, it gets harder when you have more than one purpose. You can't do everything. You'll just have to figure it out. Design in practice is more complex than theory. And there's a relative wealth of mixed methods design typologies. It's the most popular topic in mixed methods theorizing. I think it's because you can make a matrix. Everybody loves to make a matrix. It's more clear-cut than other topics. So those are my guesses about why it's so popular. It's easier in some sense. It's easier in theory. It's not easier in practice. So in the early review, we did a 57 evaluation studies. We came up with about 8 dimensions of design. 7 or 8 dimensions of design. None of these has gone away, but some have been absorbed into other ways of talking about mixed methods. The 4 that remain features of the design are here, and these same 4 will be found in every typology of mixed methods design you can find. Tashikori and Tedley, Creswell, and many others. They just configure it, the 4, differently, but it's the same 4. Are we assessing the same or different phenomena with the different methods? Are the methods or methodologies of equal weight and voice in the study, or is there a dominant methodology and the others are secondary? These are all legitimate designs. There's not a better way to do this. Is the implementation of the methods or methodologies sequential or concurrent? As we'll talk in a minute, in a triangulation design, they have to be concurrent at the same time, or what you're measuring will change. In education, the classroom in November is very different from the classroom in March. So you can't do a triangulation design across several months because whatever you're studying will have changed. So you have to do some kind of close-in-time measurement of the same phenomena. And do you mix at the end, in the inferencing part of the study, or do you mix throughout the study? Do some kind of conversation among the different data sets as you're going along. The mixing at the end, we call a component design, where the components remain relatively separate till the end. And mixing along the way, we call integrated designs. Mixing remains the challenging task. A lot easier to talk about than to do. So this is a matrix that connects purpose and design. The purposes form the rows, and these 4 dimensions of design form the columns. So we're going to look at this several times with the different purposes. But this is why I think that figuring out mixed methods purposes helps you design a stronger study for that particular purpose. Because I think these are simply logical connections. They're not anything too esoteric. So we're on a different example now, just to illustrate these design dimensions. A program evaluation of an obesity prevention and reduction program for school children, upper elementary grades, ages 6 to 10. Obesity, especially in children from poor families, remains a very serious health problem in my country. So this is not an unusual kind of program. 3 major components are encouraging the children with help from their parents and so forth to walk or bike to school, increase physical activity during the school day, and serving healthier food in the school cafeteria. This is a very typical kind of program for school children. The expected outputs, these are very short-term outcomes, you know, how are things changed in the short term? Are adequate exercise and healthy food during the school day? That's what the school has control over, not outside the school. So during the school day, the children get adequate exercises and healthy food. Outcomes are healthier children by a multiple set of indicators, physiological and otherwise. And key evaluation questions, a good evaluation tries to address the quality and fidelity of the implementation of the program. Was it implemented as designed, and how well did it go? And the magnitude of the outcomes. That's a very typical evaluation. So if we apply, if we look at 3 constructs from this study, and again, I like to mix around the constructs. That's the most logical for me. I don't think it's a personal preference, or maybe it is, but I encourage others to do it because it just makes sense. It makes the designing of a study quite straightforward, even if you have multiple methods and multiple constructs. So if we wanted to mix methods around the output, the short-term outcome of children's food consumption while at school. Remember, the output was they'll have healthy exercise and healthy food consumption during the school day. We could use a purpose of triangulation. We would mix at the method level, 2 different methods, not trying to do 2 different methodologies or paradigms, just methods. The methods could be a quantitative analysis of food eaten and food thrown away. So you don't want to just count what kids say they eat, or that you want to see how much food was wasted or thrown away. And some qualitative child reports of yummy food eaten on the same days. Some brief kind of, so what did you eat today? And how did you like it? So here's our same matrix with the triangulation row filled in. What phenomena? Well, we have to measure the same phenomena to get triangulation, so we have to be measuring the same construct, defined the same way. The status of methods are ideally equal. They don't have to be, but ideally, because they have equal voice. Sequence of implementation has to be concurrent, again, or the phenomena won't be the same. And the linking task is comparing results after the data have been collected. You don't want any conversations among the data sets while they're being collected, because that may threaten the required independence of methods in a triangulation design. If the methods are influencing one another, your argument for triangulation is weakened. So you want to keep them separate and independent, and then compare the results at the end, which is a non-trivial task. Just think about the analysis of food eaten and food thrown away compared with children's reports of what they ate and how yummy it was. That's a non-trivial task to make that comparison. These are research items for the future generation. Pay attention to. The second construct we might want to measure as an evaluator is the implementation quality of the in-school physical activity component of the program. So we want to know how well it was implemented. We could think of a purpose of complementarity for this. We want to get a richer portrait of the implementation quality by using more than one method and methodology. We want to mix at a methodological level, not just technique, but kind of whole systems of inquiry. Possibly paradigm. The methods and methodologies would include structured classroom observations, so kind of a quantitative assessment with a pre-designed instrument that we would assess what's going on in a representative sample of classrooms, perhaps likely selected for the time that the kids were supposed to be doing something active, and mini case studies of 2 to 3 purposely selected classrooms' physical activity routines. So those are 2 methodologies that we could use, aiming for some kind of complementarity, some richness, enriched portrait of implementation quality. Same matrix, and here's the complementarity purpose with its design. Again, we want to measure the same phenomena. This is implementation quality of the physical activity component of the program. Status of methods preferably equal. Again, it makes a stronger argument, but it doesn't have to be, like triangulation, it doesn't have to be, but your argument's stronger if they are. Has to be concurrent, or the phenomena will change. And here, with complementarity, you have this possibility of analysis and integration as the study's going along. or during the analysis and inferencing phase. It doesn't have to be just at the inferencing phase. It's not only a matter of comparing results, it's a matter of connecting data, analysis, and inference. So there's that option. In fact, that's a better way to do a complementarity design. We take our structured data and our observational data and we do some kind of integrated analysis of them. So our third and last phenomena would be outcome, children's understanding of the new diet and exercise facets of their school day, what sense they're making of all of this. And it's very important always to get the participant's voice in an evaluation. The children could maybe not noticing anything. There are all these adults who are scurrying around with healthy food and new physical activity, and the children don't see any difference. I'm not sure that could happen, but again, complementarity could be a purpose for this part of the study, with some openness to initiation, with some possibility that the two different methodologies may tell different stories, because again, we're dealing with children's understanding, and children have a different logic, different way of being in the world, a different understanding. So if we use a structured instrument, designed to get at the intended experience, and then we just ask children themselves, we may get some dissonance between a structured assessment of intended outcomes and the children's own sense making of what difference and what this has, how they understand this. So the level of the mix could be at all three. The methods could be multiple and varied. And again, we have the same complementarity row as well as the initiation row highlighted in the same matrix, indicating that we realize that with this particular mix, we may get some dissonant results because children's sense making, I think, is somewhat unpredictable, and we can't always assume that they will understand the program as it was designed. So, I think we're back to some, just a reprise here, and then give you a chance to have some questions or do some buzzing. So reprise, we looked at 3 different mixes. Again, I like to mix around selection of key constructs, the important phenomena I'm trying to understand in a study. Those are the best candidates for mixing. Mixing takes more resources, so you really want to use those resources on the most important phenomena. One could also think about mixing around a question, but if it's a complicated question with a lot of constructs, that would be hard. So for me, focusing on the key phenomena, the key constructs I'm interested in understanding is the way that works for me to mix methods. So we had 3 constructs: an output around children's food consumption, and that was a triangulation study with hoped-for convergence. We had a methodological mix of implementation quality of the physical activity component. That was a complementarity study. And the paradigm mix on the overall outcome of children's understanding of the study. A little bit on that last one. Many of you probably may have heard of Thomas Cook. He's a quasi-experimental methodologist in the United States, a student of Donald Campbell. And if you haven't heard about him, that's who he is. He's a senior member of the applied social science community at this time. And although he's not a mixed methodologist, he is an applied researcher and a policy evaluator. So he'll do large-scale evaluation studies. And some years ago, he talked about the potential value and importance of what he called empirical puzzles. That's his phrase, empirical puzzles. When you have data from more than one methodology, and the data don't agree, you have an empirical puzzle, which affords you an opportunity to pursue what's going on with this puzzle, likely toward some greater insight. I think it's important to keep in mind that sometimes mixing will yield dissonant results, and don't just throw things away, but think about, an empirical puzzle. I can try to pursue what's going on here with the 2 different data sets and perhaps come to some new understanding. So in our Healthy Children's evaluation example, on that third mix, we were trying to get some sense of children's understanding of the program. If we had a structured study according to the ways in which children understood the program, according to the design of the program, so we're assessing their understanding against the design of the program, and then we had a more unstructured assessment of children's understanding of the study. We could get very different results. It's not unlikely that children may report being somewhat wary, somewhat cautious about the teacher's new request to, she's going to put on some hip-hop music and they're supposed to dance for 5 minutes. This brand new request coming out of nowhere. Or run around the room 3 times. Children who had been previously asked to sit in their seats quietly might be understandably a little wary of this new system of activity in the classroom and not sure whether they could fully trust it. So I'd like to share briefly 2 real examples of mixed method studies, policy evaluations, somewhat older but still very important, and then give you a chance to do some more buzzing or make comments or questions. So these are, again, 2 policy evaluations, large-scale policy evaluations in my country, policy-oriented. The first was a housing demonstration project. So this is a project designed to demonstrate that a new housing policy is a good one. That's why we call it a demonstration project. This was from the 1990s, conducted in 5 different cities, and this is called Moving to Opportunity. These were all large cities. Los Angeles, Philadelphia, and I can't remember the others. The project sought improved economic chances and opportunities for poor people. That was the main opportunity, to give poor people some improved chances. By offering a random selection of people living in these cities, poor neighborhoods in these cities, the opportunity to move to better housing, essentially, to subsidized or even private apartments in a better neighborhood, in a middle-class neighborhood, with initial government support in the form of rent subsidies. So a random sample of people designated as potential participants in the study were offered this opportunity to move from a low-income, impoverished, and sometimes dangerous neighborhood to a housing that was subsidized at the beginning in a more middle-class neighborhood. A control group of people was identified, as well as a second comparison group of people who were offered the opportunity to move but decided not to take it. So we had the people who were offered the opportunity and took it, a control group who were not offered the opportunity, and people who were offered the opportunity but did not move. This study was being conducted by economists, my favorite social scientists. They initially focused the study on economic outcomes. Surprise, surprise. But of course that was the intent of the study too. In a moment of inspiration, fairly early in this 5-year study, this evaluation team of economists also decided to actually interview participants in the study in one city. They wanted to learn, so this was early in the study, but they wanted to learn kind of what this, why some people decided to take up the offer and others did not. So what distinguished those 2 groups. And they were also interested in better understanding what the program looked like on the ground. That's an unusual desire for economists. I like economists. Some of my best friends are economists. But that's unusual. It's not the kind of thing you hear from economists very often. So I applaud this group. They wanted to kind of find out why some people didn't take it up, and they wanted to just kind of witness firsthand what it felt like and looked like on the ground. And in the words of the evaluators, the economists who ran this evaluation, here's what they said. And MTO is the abbreviation for moving to opportunity. Forget me to do this. Here's what they said. These interviews had a profound impact on our MTO research. First, they caused us to refocus our quantitative data collection strategy on a substantially different set of outcomes. That's pretty profound. Our original research design concentrated on outcomes most familiar to labor economists. the earnings and job patterns of MTO parents and the school experiences of MTO children. However, our qualitative interviews led us to believe that MTO was producing substantial utility gains for treatment with families. There's a language, utility gains. But primarily in domains like safety and health that were not included in the original outcome data collection plan. The interviews helped us to add these safety and health outcomes to our evaluation plan, and in our subsequent quantitative work, we found the largest program effects in the domains suggested by the interviewees. MTO appeared to have important impacts on safety, child behavior, and health, but no effects on adult earnings or welfare usage. Second, this qualitative fieldwork led us to develop an overall conceptual framework for thinking about the mechanisms through which changes in outcomes due to moves out of high poverty areas might occur. It helped them think better about what is actually happening as people move out of high poverty neighborhoods to safer and middle income neighborhoods. Our conversations with MTO mothers were dominated by their powerful descriptions of their fear that their children would become victims of violence if they remained in high poverty households. These mothers perceived this violence as random, rather than targeted at them or their children, more like a stray bullet than a personal robbery at knife point. But their fear was acute, and it was so deep-seated that their daily routine was focused on keeping their children safe. The title for the article in which this study was reported that I read is called "Bullets Don't Got No Name," in the words of one of the participants. So it was random violence, but still pervasive and terrifying. So I think that's an amazing turnaround in a study by the wise decision of the evaluators to go out to the field and talk to some of the participants. The second study is an evaluation called New Hope. This was a 5-year evaluation of an anti-poverty program in the city of Milwaukee, Wisconsin in the early 2000s. These are not labor economists, these are social science researchers, child development people mostly, and they designed an experimental design in which they offered a random sample of poor families in Milwaukee their choices of subsidies for returning to school, employment training, child care, and health care. So subsidies were offered in all those areas, going back to school, employment training, child care, and health care, and the families could take 1, 2, 3, or all 4 of these. Again, those not offered these opportunities constituted the control group. The evaluation design from the outset included an ethnographic component nested within the randomized experiment. In truth, that decision was influenced by the fact that all the researchers on this study were members of a national network of research related to child well-being that was focusing on mixing methods. So this was a more purposeful intention. The ethnography studied the daily lives of 20 families randomly selected from each group using an ecocultural framework. The author of the framework is Thomas Weisner, in case any of you know it. One of the things I like so much about this study is most qualitative inquiry, case studies, interviews, observations, use a purposefully selected sample. We want rich data. We only can sample a few people, so we want the data to be very rich, and we sample purposefully. Here's an ethnographic component of an experimental study that not only looked at experimental families, but control group families, and sampled them randomly. They sampled 20 families from each group randomly. I just think that's so... They used the logic of sampling from experimentation to select their qualitative sample. That's not what we would normally do. We would select families very carefully, probably to try to find out the effectiveness of the program at its very best. What's the potential? Or maybe extreme cases. People who took up all the subsidies, people who took up none or one of them. So I love this. I just think it's so clever to kind of take this logic of sampling from experimentation and apply it to what is essentially a qualitative component. You don't usually sample that way. The major premise of this framework, this eco-cultural framework that was used to do a set of interviews with these families, this is a mantra for life in my view, is that things that are important and consequential to people show up in their daily lives. Oh, common sense, I love it. If it's important, it will show up. Maybe not every day, but if you ask people about daily life over a period of weeks and months, things that are important will be there. Things that are important to them. So they didn't ask them, did you participate in this activity or that activity of the program? They asked them to tell me about your day. Tell me about what you did Tuesday. Tell me about Friday. Tell me about it. And if something's important, it's a big part of their life, it will be there. So I like that a lot. So this New Hope program showed no effects for the program on adults after 2 years of the program, and very modest school effects for boys. Boys in the experimental group did a little bit better than boys in the control group, and no effects for girls in terms of school achievement. The significant contribution of the ethnographic component was to understand why not. Why didn't this make a difference in people's lives? In brief, from the ethnographic component, if you did not know which group the family was in, if you read the ethnography about a particular family, you wouldn't know from the data. There was no kind of group difference between the two sets of 20 families each. The daily lives of both groups of families in terms of the ease or the stress created by income levels and opportunities, needs for childcare and healthcare and the like, were very similar in content and structure. As it turned out, these were generally good economic times in the city of Milwaukee, and many families with limited incomes had access to these same kinds of services. It wasn't the best city to study it, it turns out. The New Hope program that is entered an already crowded service market. So I think these studies well illustrate the ways in which different methods can meaningfully and appropriately tap into interests, perspectives, and values of different stakeholders, and the ways in which the mixed methods approach can engage a plurality of methodological traditions. When methods are mixed respectfully, political and cultural pluralism can be engaged, and ideally democratic dialogues across difference can be fostered. So I'd like to pause again to give you a chance to chat with each other or to critique something, raise a challenge, offer a comment.